So, thank you, Yoon and the Stimson Center for hosting us today, and Professor Lapson for making this project possible. Now, if you're here at 9:30 in the morning on a Friday, you probably already know this, but I'll say it anyway. Taiwan has long occupied a paradoxical position in the international system. It's a flourishing liberal democracy. It has a vibrant, globalized economy, the 21st largest in the world by some measures. It has a population that is roughly the same size as Australia's. It is, by almost any measure or standard, a state. And yet, China considers it a renegade province and is actively taking steps to isolate it economically, politically, and diplomatically. Most ominous, far from renouncing the use of force, China has been actively building its ability to resolve the issue by military means. Now, we can debate whether or not China will ever decide to attack Taiwan. But I think it's clear, and I think most of us are in agreement, that Taiwan must take steps to convince China that the costs of attacking will grossly outweigh any conceivable benefits. In other words, Taiwan must deter China. Now, for years, Taiwan has taken a very traditional approach to deterrence. And despite taking some modest steps towards an asymmetric force posture in recent years, it has mainly focused on acquiring symmetric capabilities, things like tanks, fighter jets, surface ships, and plans to use them to wage decisive battles for control over the air, land, and sea. Now, to be sure, it's entirely possible that Taiwan's existing deterrence posture is working. After all, China hasn't yet attacked. But I don't think this is grounds for, or the time for, confidence and complacency. Because as we argue in our report, time is on China's side. China's defense budget is already roughly 15 times that of Taiwan's. China will soon, therefore, have both qualitative and quantitative superiority over Taiwan, if it doesn't already. In order to explore alternative ways that Taiwan might think about its deterrent options, the Schar School's Center for Security Policy Studies launched what I consider to be an innovative and collaborative research project. And I'm not just saying that because I was part of this team. I think it was unique and innovative because it was a true collaboration between multiple universities, with professors from George Mason and from the University of Waterloo, and because we included 5 PhD students and candidates from George Mason University. The other reason I think it's unique, especially given that we're approaching Veterans Day, is that of our team, 4 of us were veterans of the US military, representing each of the armed services. And if you were to add our active and reserve experience together, we have something like 70 years of military experience to bring to bear on the challenge. And so, prior to our trip to Taipei in January of 2018, we spent several months doing background research. We then spent a week in Taipei conducting interviews, and the entirety of the spring semester last year working on our report. Now, before diving into some of the details of the report, I do think it's worth briefly mentioning 2 of the assumptions that guided our analysis throughout. The first is that although we may see shifts, at least on the margins, we think or we assume that US policy towards Taiwan will be unlikely to change, at least in some fundamental level, in the near to midterm. Our second assumption is similar. Although we might see small fluctuations, we assume that Taiwan's defense budget is likely or unlikely, it is likely to not change significantly over the near term. We also limit our analysis in 2 very important ways. The first is that we focus heavily on military matters. It's not to say that diplomatic, political, and informational tools aren't important. Taiwan assuredly must take a whole-of-government approach to deterring aggression, and it needs to use every asset that it has at its disposal. At the same time, we feel that our comparative advantage in looking at this problem is to focus on the military side of the issue, and so this is where we focus our effort. We also, and we need to be clear, focus exclusively on conventional, non-nuclear deterrence options. Now, we start our report by assessing China's intentions. And again, it goes without saying that intentions are notoriously hard to divine, right? Actions are ambiguous. And states obviously have powerful incentives to misrepresent their true goals and objectives. At the same time, in Taiwan's case, the challenge is actually a bit easier. After all, even if there's no room, or there's a lot of room, sorry, to debate China's intentions towards the overarching international and regional order, there's really no room to argue about China's intentions towards Taiwan. Put bluntly, China wants to assert political control over the island. It sees this as a non-negotiable core national interest, and as President Xi has said repeatedly, it is increasingly unwilling to kick the can down the road. Now, even if China's intentions are clear, Taiwan's options for deterring potential aggression are not. And this is because we argue that Taiwan faces a deterrence trilemma. And by trilemma, we mean that Taiwan has to do three things in order to deter aggression, but that these three tasks are in inevitable tension with one another. So the first, Taiwan has to be able to counter so-called gray zone provocations. And by gray zone, we simply mean the subversive actions that China takes to violate Taiwan's territorial integrity, its waters, and its airspace, but doing so without provoking a military response. And of course, the best way to counter gray zone provocations is to use high visibility platforms and weapon systems like surface ships and fighter jets to intercept and challenge and signal Taiwan's resolve over these issues. Second, Taiwan has to be able to convince China that any decision to use force to invade will be unacceptably costly. To do this task, Taiwan needs to have military forces and assets that will survive long enough in a war that they can destroy and degrade any conceivably sized invasion force. Yet at the same time, because we know that China is likely to use its large ballistic missile inventory, special operations forces, cyber campaigns, and other means to try and preempt Taiwan's defenses, to smash them out of existence before it launches that invasion force, it means that Taiwan needs to have large numbers of highly survivable assets and units to accomplish this. The third task is in some ways the most inexorable. Taiwan has to do both these things. It has to counter in the gray zone, and it has to be able to impose unacceptable costs, has to do both these things without breaking the bank. If Taiwan had an unlimited defense budget, it could simply buy lots of high-performance weapon systems, which would allow it to both challenge in the gray zone and at the same time ensure that it had enough weapons left over to absorb a first strike and still impose unacceptable costs. But Taiwan, like every other state in the international system, it doesn't have an unlimited budget, and so it has to make tough choices. We argue that there's a better way to make these very difficult trade-offs. Specifically, we offer what we're calling an elastic denial in depth strategy, and it's built around three main recommendations. The first is that Taiwan should accept more risk than it's currently willing to in the gray zone. The second is that Taiwan should focus, it should prioritize imposing unacceptable costs in the worst case invasion scenario. And third, and perhaps most controversially, we think that Taiwan must begin serious planning for what we see as the ultimate form of deterrence: territorial defense and popular resistance. Right, to talk about each of these in more detail, I'll start with accepting risk in the gray zone. Now, without a doubt, gray zone provocations are a problem. Taiwan cannot ignore them completely. China uses invasions of Taiwanese airspace, water, and land in order to erode confidence, establish new facts on the ground, and perhaps most insidiously, to generate new intelligence that's useful for future military operations. At the same time, we think there are at least two reasons that Taiwan can accept more risk in the gray zone. The first of these is that China does not need to prevail in the gray zone in order to assert political control over Taiwan. In social scientific terms, winning in the gray zone is neither necessary nor sufficient. In fact, if Taiwan's government and people are to give up based on gray zone challenges alone, then it would mean that Taiwan would have far more profound sources of vulnerability than any military strategy alone can solve. Second, China may actually be using gray zone operations because it wants to avoid escalation. Right? Gray zone operations let the Chinese leadership look like it's doing something about the Taiwan problem without actually running the risks of mounting a full-scale invasion. But because doing nothing isn't an option, right, because the Taiwan problem is a core non-negotiable issue, if Taiwan were to manage to completely foreclose the gray zone, it is entirely possible that the Chinese leadership might believe that escalation is now the only remaining option. Again, we don't think that Taiwan should completely cede the gray zone to China. we think it still needs to challenge violations of its waters and airspace. We just don't think that Taiwan needs F-35s and Aegis-like surface ships to do this. Its existing platforms, although not perfect, are good enough. Taiwan can intercept a spy plane with an older F-16. By accepting risk in the gray zone, Taiwan will then have more resources that it can focus on what we see as being the real threat, the primary challenge, an invasion. And we think that it should use these freed up resources in a particular way. We think that Taiwan needs to shift from a defensive mindset to a denial mindset. This might sound like a rhetorical difference, but it actually is quite meaningful. Defense implies that you are fighting for control. Denial means you're simply trying to make it costly for the other side to establish and exercise control, even if you yourself cannot exercise control. It's fitting that on the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War, to think denial means being okay with creating a no man's land. Now, to do this, we think Taiwan should invest in large numbers of anti-access weapons that can wear down an invasion force as it attempts to cross the strait. And instead of seeking a decisive battle at any point along that continuum, we think that Taiwan's defenders need to prepare to fight elastically. That is to say, we think they should impose costs, retreat, regroup, impose costs, and repeat this process for as long as possible. In practical terms, we think that Taiwan should organize its denial operations into 4 zones: air, water, land, and social. The first 3 zones, we think that Taiwan's active duty forces are capable, even as currently structured more or less if given the right weapons, of handling. In the air, we think that the Taiwanese need to divest of certainly high-end jets, or some of them. It should stop trying to pursue the F-35, and it should instead invest heavily in anti-air missiles. And in our report, we go into some amount of detail as to how it can employ these tactically to kind of enhance its ability to deny air control. At sea, again, we think that Taiwan should abandon its pursuit of Aegis-like surface ships, as well as the indigenously produced diesel submarine, and instead use the resources freed from these programs to invest in things like mini-submersibles, semi-submersibles, naval mines, anti-ship cruise missiles, and other such coastal defenses. And on the ground, we think that Taiwan's army should reorganize itself to fight small unit actions, prioritizing coastal defense and retrograde fighting denial operations. The 4th zone, the social zone, leads us to what, again, is probably our most controversial recommendation, that of creating a territorial defense force. Simply put, if China wants to assert political control over the island, it must assert political control over Taiwanese society. We think that Taiwan can take steps, the ultimate form of deterrence, to prevent this, or certainly to make it unacceptably costly. And it can do this by threatening to wage an insurgency. Now, we don't think that an insurgency will happen spontaneously, and in fact, Taiwan must take steps now to make sure that one could be waged credibly. Taiwan's active duty forces, we think, should focus on denial operations in the air, at sea, and on land, but social denial should be transferred over to the reserve forces. Currently, as some people know, Taiwan is trying to emulate the US operational reserve model. We think this is a mistake, and we argue in our monograph for several reasons that Taiwan would be better served transforming its reserve force into a territorial defense force that trains its reservists to wage guerrilla war. I think I've said enough. Maybe I've said too much. I'll conclude briefly. We think that time is no longer on Taiwan's side. China appears to be growing impatient with the status quo. We propose an elastic denial-in-depth strategy for dealing with this challenge. Whether or not Taiwan takes our ideas under consideration is less important, we think, than it is to spark an important and somewhat overdue conversation about the challenges that it faces.
Okay, great. So I want to thank Yun for inviting me here today. I thought this was a great report, and in general, I just kind of want to make a few comments that hopefully will kind of set the stage for a broader discussion. Okay, so let me just quickly kind of say a few things I really like about the report. I really like that the authors pay great attention to the issue of opportunity costs. This is, I think, central when kind of thinking about Taiwan's defense strategy. And in particular, I like the idea of kind of presenting Taiwan's choices as representing a trilemma. And I think the authors are absolutely right that ultimately what it comes down to is kind of a trade-off between dealing robustly and having the platforms that would be necessary to deal robustly with gray zone provocations versus investing in raising the kind of actual cost of an invasion scenario. And I think the authors are absolutely right that kind of the latter should be the priority in Taiwan's kind of defense posture. So I like that. I like the way that the report is framed. And broadly speaking, I find the conclusions to be quite compelling. Okay, so my comments are generally kind of things that are meant to kind of foster some kind of further discussion and raise some points that the authors might want to consider if they're going to develop this further. Okay, so the first two kind of things I want to raise kind of center on kind of the feasibility of actually implementing some of the proposals that are put forward in the report. Taiwan, of course, is a highly polarized society, and so my first kind of concern is, given the ambitiousness of the report's recommendations, I just wonder how realistic it is to get the sort of broad buy-in from across Taiwan's political spectrum to undertake this sort of a reform. And the authors kind of note this in the report, but I guess I just kind of wondered how you actually kind of concretely get to reaching some sort of consensus in Taiwan in that kind of polarized environment concerning broad changes in the country's defense posture. A second thing that I want to kind of put on the table concerns why it is that, given that not just kind of this report, but defense analysts for at least a decade have been kind of making the argument that that Taiwan should be kind of moving in an asymmetric direction, that it's going to become increasingly impossible to kind of match China dollar for dollar or weapon system for weapon system as China continues to develop and become more militarily capable. So the question is, I think one question is, why does Taiwan nonetheless continue to be interested in kind of the sorts of weapons procurement and development strategies that the report recommends against? And the authors in the report kind of highlight a number of kind of possible explanations in this regard, and these tend to be kind of strategic explanations. So one argument that you sometimes hear in Taiwan is that there's kind of a signaling logic. Buying high-profile weapon systems from the United States signals a U.S. commitment to Taiwan. Developing projects like the indigenous submarine is something that signals to the Taiwan public that the government is serious about defense. And I think that's plausible as part of the explanation. Kind of another possibility is that the Taiwan government cares more than maybe it should in kind of dealing toe-to-toe on gray zone provocations. And again, I think that's plausible. But something that's kind of left out here and that I think kind of deserves kind of some further consideration is kind of whether there might be some sort of political economy logic playing out. And so I think that kind of any effort to push forward kind of fundamental reforms in Taiwan's defense posture requires kind of a very careful consideration of who in Taiwan is benefiting from kind of the status quo defense posture, right? So what industries are benefiting from that, what individuals are benefiting that, and why, right? And what's it going to take to kind of win them over or neutralize them in kind of policy debates, right, if you're going to have this kind of transformation in Taiwan's defense posture. Okay, so that's something that I'd like to see more of as this is developed further. Okay, so a third kind of issue that I want to put on the table kind of concerns kind of how China views the likely costs that it would pay in fighting a war in the Taiwan Strait, right? So the basic idea here is that that Taiwan should be kind of altering its defense posture in a way that kind of maximizes China's expected costs of kind of trying to invade and occupy Taiwan. And it kind of makes, the report kind of makes an implicit assumption, right, that costs are essentially costs from the minds of Chinese leaders, in the minds of Chinese leaders, right? So the costs associated with actually kind of crossing the Taiwan Strait and invading Taiwan, right, are similar, like qualitatively, to the costs that would be incurred in actually trying to govern Taiwan effectively, right? So hypothetically, the authors are kind of saying if it costs $10 trillion to invade Taiwan and $1 trillion to stabilize it, that's the same in the minds of Chinese leaders as it being $1 trillion to invade and $10 trillion to stabilize. Okay, but I guess I'm not sure that it actually works out like this in practice. And so you could kind of imagine two scenarios. So in the first, China's spending a ton of money and lives trying to establish some sort of kind of minimal beachhead on Taiwan. Okay, the optics of this look terrible. Ships are sinking. It isn't clear whether China's going to succeed. Lives are being lost. China's being denounced internationally, the economy's coming under strain. It's something that would be a really bad situation for a Chinese leader, potentially a humiliating situation. Okay, it'd be really hard to frame what is happening in that scenario as a success. If anything, it's going to start looking more and more like a fiasco from the perspective of a Chinese leader or elites in China, something that Chinese leaders would very much want to avoid. Okay, but if you kind of think of a second scenario where China is able to kind of establish a limited foothold in Taiwan, and then it's kind of facing like these long-term kind of insurgency costs, right? I don't know that China would worry as much about that, right? I think what you would see is a China that would immediately declare victory, right? Because there's a presence in Taiwan. Okay, the government would kind of move into full propaganda mode, talking about how, this great goal of national unification has been accomplished. Okay, and there would be parades and so forth, right? And what would be left is kind of a mop-up operation, right? Now that we've accomplished this great national objective of unification, now we just need to kind of clean up and kind of stabilize the situation, right? And I think it would be very easy for a leader to kind of frame kind of an initial victory in that way. And it would be very easy for a leader to kind of justify spending a lot of resources kind of conducting a stabilization campaign in Taiwan. A lot easier than it would be to kind of justify like a very uncertain kind of initial invasion that might be going poorly. Okay, and so I think that there's some risk in kind of putting a lot of eggs into this kind of make Taiwan hard to govern sort of basket, given that we don't really know how Chinese leaders think about these different types of costs. Okay, and that kind of goes even beyond just kind of, I think on a more fundamental level, I think it's really hard to make it credible to Chinese leaders, right, that there really is kind of a possibility of kind of a prolonged and costly insurgency in Taiwan. Okay, a fourth point concerns the author's assumption that the United States won't get involved in a cross-strait conflict. And here I basically agree with what the authors are doing, which is kind of assuming that we're in a worst-case scenario and that the U.S. won't get involved, and that makes sense. So you don't want to assume U.S. involvement, and if it doesn't materialize and you've kind of based your strategy on the U.S. getting involved, then Taiwan's in bad shape, right? So I think it makes sense to kind of think in terms of this worst-case scenario, as long as kind of it's really is kind of an overkill situation. But I do think it's important to kind of be explicit that if the U.S. does get involved, this posture still works, right? And so I think that something should be said about kind of like some kind of discussion in the report or like in a future iteration should kind of talk about like how this kind of this kind of strategy works in the event of U.S. intervention, just to kind of make clear that if the U.S. becomes involved, that the recommendations here wouldn't work at cross purposes. And then finally, I think it's worth considering to some degree whether the recommendations in the report affect not only China's expected costs of fighting a war, but also the benefits that China derives from the status quo in the Taiwan Strait. And ultimately, when kind of thinking about what it's going to take to deter the PRC from attacking Taiwan, we need to think about not only kind of the cost that the PRC is going to incur in launching an attack, but also how tolerable is the status quo, right? And so if the status quo looks relatively good, right, then it takes kind of a lower threshold of kind of cost to deter, right? But if the status quo is looking more and more intolerable from Beijing's perspective, right, then it's going to take a higher amount of cost to effectively deter. Okay, and so one question I had is whether kind of some of the recommendations in the report might not only kind of be affecting China's expected costs, but might also kind of play into China's evaluation of how tolerable the status quo is. And here I'm especially thinking in terms of kind of some of the recommendations that focus on kind of consolidating a Taiwan-centric identity. Okay, so clearly this is something that potentially motivates people in Taiwan to kind of fight harder, right? And so it's potentially something that increases the cost for China, right? But it also, if you're in the PRC, it kind of starts to make Taiwan look like, it makes it look like the PRC is losing Taiwan, right? And it becomes, even if a leader wants to kind of focus on something else, like economic development or whatever other problems that China, the myriad other problems that China faces, it becomes harder to do so if, like in Taiwan, it looks like Taiwan's kind of moving in the wrong direction, and the PRC's policy toward Taiwan isn't working. And so there's going to be kind of more pressure on PRC leaders to do something about that. The status quo is going to start to kind of be less valuable from China's perspective. And so I think it's kind of important to at least kind of address this issue of whether the recommendations affect China's kind of willingness to tolerate the status quo. So I'll leave my comments there, and I think the audience will have a lot more kind of interesting topics to bring up.